The fabric tore with the sound like breaking bones. Grace Winters stood frozen as her dress split down the back, exposing her bra to 31 laughing students. In that moment, staring at Bryce Sterling's smirking face, she made a choice that would send 3 boys to the hospital and expose a conspiracy that reached the school board. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change everything. The security cameras caught every second, and by lunch, blood was on the classroom floor. The substitute teacher they thought was weak had been hiding something deadly. If you've ever felt powerless watching injustice unfold, what happened next will either inspire you or terrify you. Because sometimes the quiet ones are quiet for a reason. Grace had arrived at Westridge Academy 3 weeks earlier, carrying nothing but a worn leather messenger bag and 15 years of teaching experience that nobody seemed to value. At 29, she was younger than most veteran faculty, but older than the fresh college graduates who usually got hired for long-term substitute positions. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her simple cardigans and dark slacks suggested someone who preferred blending in to standing out. What her professional appearance didn't reveal was the collection of martial arts medals hidden in her apartment closet, or the calloused knuckles that came from years of training that had saved her life more than once. The suburb of Millbrook, Connecticut, was exactly the kind of place Grace had tried to avoid. Too wealthy, too white, too comfortable with its own assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. But after her divorce had drained her savings and forced her to sell the house in Hartford, she'd needed work fast. When Westridge Academy offered her a temporary position covering for their AP history teacher who'd gone on medical leave, Grace had swallowed her pride and accepted. She needed the health insurance, needed the steady paycheck, and told herself it was only temporary. Westridge Academy sat like a monument to old money privilege, its Gothic revival architecture and manicured grounds screaming exclusivity. The annual tuition of $60,000 ensured that only the children of Connecticut's elite walked these hallways. These weren't just wealthy kids. They were legacy students whose great-grandfathers had endowments named after them, whose mothers chaired charity galas, whose fathers controlled banks and courtrooms. Bryce Sterling embodied everything Grace had learned to despise about entitled privilege. At 17, he stood 6'2" with the kind of athletic build that came from personal trainers and expensive lacrosse camps. His perfectly styled brown hair, designer clothes, and practiced smile masked something darker underneath. As senior class president and captain of the varsity lacrosse team, Bryce commanded social hierarchies with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His father, federal judge Richard Sterling, had built a career on tough-on-crime rhetoric while secretly taking bribes to protect the wealthy families whose children attended schools like Westridge. Madison Cross served as Bryce's lieutenant in their reign of psychological terror. The daughter of pharmaceutical heiress Victoria Cross, Madison had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and used it like a weapon. Her platinum blonde hair and designer wardrobe were tools of intimidation, visual reminders of the social gulf between her and anyone who didn't belong to Connecticut's ruling class. She documented everything on social media, turning cruelty into viral content for their exclusive circle. Tyler Hunt provided the muscle when subtle intimidation wasn't enough. The son of a corporate merger attorney, Tyler had grown up watching his father destroy companies and lives with paperwork and proxy votes. He'd learned early that power meant the ability to hurt others without consequence, and he wielded his 200-pound frame like a blunt instrument against anyone who challenged their group's authority. Savannah Bell completed their inner circle as the social media strategist who could destroy reputations with carefully crafted rumors and viral harassment campaigns. Her father owned the largest marketing firm in New England, and she'd inherited his understanding of how to manipulate public perception. She could make someone disappear from social existence with a few well-placed posts and coordinated attacks. The trouble had started Grace's first week when she'd assigned reading from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, alongside the traditional textbook. The assignment was designed to give students multiple perspectives on American history, but it had triggered something primal in Bryce's worldview. During class discussion about the Industrial Revolution, Grace had mentioned how robber barons had used corruption and violence to build their fortunes. "Are you saying successful businessmen are criminals?" Bryce had interrupted, his voice carrying the entitled outrage of someone whose family fortune might be connected to those very robber barons. "I'm saying we should examine how power actually operates in American society," Grace had replied calmly. "Historical analysis requires looking at uncomfortable truths." That simple exchange had marked Grace as an enemy. In Bryce's mind, questioning the mythology of American exceptionalism was equivalent to a personal attack on his family's legacy. Within hours, Madison had started a group chat called Operation Cleanup, where they began planning Grace's psychological destruction. The first round of attacks had been subtle. During Grace's second week, she'd discovered her car had been keyed in the faculty parking lot. The word socialist was scratched deep into the paint, the letters jagged and angry. When she'd reported it to administration, Principal Harrison had expressed sympathy, but explained that security cameras in that section were mysteriously malfunctioning. "These things happen," he'd said with a shrug that suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about a substitute teacher's property damage. "Maybe you should consider parking closer to the main building." Grace had recognized the pattern immediately. She'd taught in urban schools where administration often looked the other way when certain students faced harassment, but she'd never expected to encounter the same willful blindness in an elite institution that prided itself on character education and moral leadership. The psychological warfare had escalated throughout her third week. Grace would arrive to find her classroom door covered with printouts of negative reviews about liberal propaganda in education, the pages taped up like a shrine to intimidation. Her lesson plans would disappear from her desk, forcing her to recreate hours of work. During class, Bryce and his crew would stage coordinated disruptions, asking loaded questions designed to make her look like a radical activist rather than a professional educator. "Miss Winters," Bryce would say with theatrical politeness, "my father says that teachers who push political agendas are actually violating their professional ethics. Shouldn't education be objective rather than biased?" The question was a trap designed to make Grace look defensive regardless of how she answered. If she explained that all education involved perspective and interpretation, they'd accuse her of admitting bias. If she claimed objectivity, they'd point to her assigned readings as evidence of hypocrisy. Grace had learned to navigate these conversational minefields, but the constant vigilance was exhausting. Madison had been documenting everything, creating a carefully edited narrative that portrayed Grace as an unstable radical who couldn't handle classroom management. Short video clips showed Grace looking flustered or frustrated, but never included the context of coordinated harassment that had provoked those reactions. The edited footage circulated through social media, building a case that Grace was unfit for her position. Coach Reynolds, who served as both athletic director and Bryce's personal protector, had made his position clear during a faculty meeting Grace's third week. "Some of our students come from families with strong traditional values," he'd announced while looking directly at Grace. "We need to be sensitive to those values when selecting educational materials. Not everyone agrees with revisionist history or social justice narratives." The message was unmistakable: conform to their worldview or face the consequences. Grace had spent that weekend researching Connecticut employment law and consulting with an attorney about workplace harassment. She'd started documenting every interaction, every incident, every veiled threat. If they wanted to play hardball, she'd be ready. Friday morning brought the final escalation. Grace had assigned her AP History class to analyze primary sources about civil rights-era resistance movements. The lesson plan included excerpts from Martin Luther King Jr. as Letter from Birmingham Jail, alongside speeches by Malcolm X and writings by James Baldwin. It was standard curriculum in most American schools, but at Westridge Academy, it represented a direct challenge to the comfortable narratives that allowed wealthy families to ignore systemic inequality. Bryce had arrived that morning with unusual energy, speaking in hushed tones to his inner circle before class began. Grace had noticed their coordinated positioning around the classroom, with Tyler stationed near the door and Madison setting up her phone at an angle that would capture Grace's desk. Savannah had invited several students from other classes to observe, claiming there would be something worth seeing during second period. The lesson had begun normally enough. Grace introduced the primary sources and asked students to consider different approaches to social change. When she'd mentioned that some civil rights leaders advocated for more aggressive resistance to injustice, Bryce had raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "Miss Winters," he'd said with the kind of smile that promised violence, "are you encouraging students to be aggressive toward authority figures? Because that sounds like you're promoting criminal behavior." "I'm encouraging critical thinking about historical methods of social change," Grace had replied, maintaining her professional composure despite recognizing the trap being set. Understanding different perspectives doesn't mean endorsing violence. "But you're clearly sympathetic to the more radical approaches," Madison had chimed in from her position behind the phone camera. "You assigned Malcolm X instead of focusing on peaceful leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. That seems like you're pushing a specific agenda." Grace had felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before a confrontation. These weren't genuine questions about curriculum. They were accusations designed to provoke an emotional response that could be edited and weaponized against her. She'd taken a deep breath and prepared to redirect the discussion when Bryce had stood up from his desk. "I think we've heard enough," he'd announced with the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of adults. "Miss Winters, you clearly don't understand the values that Westridge Academy represents. Maybe it's time someone taught you how things really work around here." That's when he'd reached for her dress. The grab had been quick and vicious, Bryce's fingers catching the fabric at her neckline and pulling with enough force to tear the material completely down her back. The sound of ripping cloth had filled the classroom like a gunshot, followed by the collective gasp of 31 teenagers watching their substitute teacher's humiliation. Grace had stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the cool air against her exposed skin and processing the reality of what had just happened. Physical assault, sexual harassment, public humiliation, all captured on video for social media distribution. In those 3 seconds, she'd made a choice that would change everything. The transformation had been instantaneous and terrifying. Grace's 15 years of martial arts training had kicked in automatically, her body shifting from professional educator to lethal weapon in the span of a heartbeat. Her stance had changed, weight distributed for maximum balance and explosive movement. Her hands had relaxed, but positioned for devastating strikes. Most importantly, something had shifted in her eyes, a predatory focus that made several students instinctively push back in their chairs. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Grace had said in a voice so calm it was more frightening than screaming would have been. Bryce, still high on the adrenaline of his successful humiliation, hadn't recognized the danger he'd triggered. What are you going to do? Hit me, prove you're everything they say about people like you. The comment had revealed the deeper prejudices driving his harassment. The assumption that Grace's working-class background made her inherently violent and unstable. It was exactly the kind of stereotyping that had allowed wealthy families to justify their children's cruelty toward anyone who didn't share their privileged status. Tyler had sensed the shift in classroom dynamics and moved to support his friend, approaching Grace's left side while Bryce blocked her front. They'd done this before, used their size and coordination to intimidate teachers and students who'd challenged their authority. What they hadn't expected was facing someone who'd been trained to handle multiple attackers with lethal efficiency. When Bryce had reached out to push Grace again, she'd caught his wrist and executed a joint lock that dropped him to his knees in less than 2 seconds. The technique was precise, controlled, and devastating. Tyler's attempt to grab her from behind had resulted in a perfectly timed hip throw that sent his 200-pound frame crashing into a row of desks. The entire confrontation had lasted 47 seconds. When it was over, Bryce was sobbing on the floor with a broken nose. Tyler was unconscious against the back wall, and Grace was standing calmly in the center of the classroom, adjusting her torn dress with the composure of someone who'd just solved a minor administrative problem. Madison's phone had captured everything, but instead of the footage showing Grace's breakdown and humiliation, it documented a textbook case of self-defense against multiple attackers. The video that was supposed to destroy Grace's career had instead created irrefutable evidence of her student's criminal assault and her own professional competence under extreme pressure. The blood on the classroom floor came from Bryce's broken nose. Dark droplets scattered across the white tiles like abstract art. Grace had looked down at the crimson evidence of his hubris and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete vindication. The entitled bully, who'd thought he could destroy her with impunity, was bleeding at her feet, and 31 witnesses had watched justice unfold in real time. Principal Harrison had burst into the classroom with security guards, expecting to find Grace either fled or cowering. Instead, he'd discovered 2 of his star students requiring medical attention, while their intended victim stood calmly explaining the legal concept of self-defense to the remaining class. "Miss Winters," he'd stammered, clearly struggling to process the scene before him. "What happened here? Bryce Sterling sexually assaulted me by tearing my clothing." Grace had replied with professional precision. "Tyler Hunt attempted to physically restrain me when I defended myself. Everything is documented on multiple cell phone cameras. I'll be filing charges for assault, sexual harassment, and conspiracy to deprive me of my civil rights." The mention of federal civil rights violations had drained the color from Harrison's face. This wasn't a simple disciplinary matter that could be handled with detentions and parent conferences. This was a potential federal case that could destroy careers and cost the district millions in settlements. As paramedics treated Tyler's concussion and Bryce's broken nose, Grace had calmly gathered her materials and prepared to leave the classroom. But before walking out, she'd turned to address the students who were still processing what they'd witnessed. "Let this be a lesson about the difference between power and strength," she'd said quietly. "Power is what you're born with. Strength is what you earn. And sometimes, strength has to remind power that actions have consequences." The video of Grace's statement had gone viral within hours, shared across social media platforms with captions like, "Teacher destroys entitled bullies," and "This is how you handle harassment." But the viral fame was just the beginning of a story that would expose decades of corruption, destroy powerful careers, and reshape everything people thought they knew about justice in America's elite institutions. What Grace didn't know yet was that her victory in the classroom had triggered something much bigger than a school disciplinary case. Federal Judge Richard Sterling was about to make a confession that would reveal how her father's death 15 years earlier had been connected to the same system of corruption that had protected Bryce and his friends from consequences. The war for Westridge Academy's soul was just beginning, and Grace Winters had just fired the opening shot that would bring down an empire built on privilege and protected by blood. The real battle was about to begin, and what happened next would shock even Grace herself. Because sometimes, when you stand up to bullies, you discover they're just the tip of a much darker iceberg. By 3 p.m. that Friday afternoon, the video had been viewed over 2 million times, and Grace Winters had become the most famous substitute teacher in America. But fame was the least of her concerns as she sat in attorney Sarah Martinez's office, reviewing documents that would expose a conspiracy reaching from Westridge Academy's boardroom to the highest levels of Connecticut's judicial system. The call had come at exactly 2:15 p.m., just as Grace finished giving her statement to Detective Maria Santos. The voice on the other end had been shaking, barely recognizable as belonging to Federal Judge Richard Sterling. "Miss Winters," he'd said, his words slurred slightly with what sounded like alcohol. "I need to see you immediately. There are things about your father's death that you need to know, things I should have told someone 15 years ago." Grace had felt her blood turn to ice. Her father, Dr. Marcus Winters, had died in a car accident when she was 14. The official report had blamed driver error and icy roads, but Grace had always suspected something more sinister. Her father had been investigating financial irregularities at the private school where he taught, Westridge Academy's sister institution in Hartford. He'd been scheduled to present his findings to the State Education Board the week after his death. Now, sitting across from the man whose son had just assaulted her, Grace was about to learn the truth that had shaped her entire life. Judge Sterling looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 4 hours. His perfectly styled silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hands trembled as he poured himself another scotch from the bottle he'd brought to the meeting. Attorney Martinez had insisted on recording everything, and Sterling had agreed without hesitation. "Your father was going to destroy me," Sterling began, his voice hollow with 15 years of accumulated guilt. "He'd discovered the payments, the fixed cases, the whole system we'd built to protect families like mine from consequences." Grace gripped the arms of her chair, forcing herself to remain calm as Sterling detailed how her father had uncovered a network of corruption that connected Connecticut's elite private schools to its judicial system. Wealthy families had been paying bribes to ensure their children faced no real consequences for criminal behavior. Drug charges disappeared, assault cases were dismissed, even sexual assault allegations vanished into sealed records. "Marcus had documentation of everything," Sterling continued, tears streaming down his face. "Bank records, court files, recorded conversations. He was going to expose all of us, destroy the entire system. We couldn't let that happen." The accident had been arranged by Harold Morrison, a private investigator with connections to organized crime who specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy clients. Grace's father's car had been sabotaged, the brake lines cut, and the steering mechanism tampered with. On a snowy February evening, Dr. Marcus Winters had lost control of his vehicle on Route 95 and died instantly when his car struck a concrete barrier. "We made it look like driver error," Sterling whispered, his confession barely audible. "Blamed the weather, closed the investigation quickly. Your mother never suspected anything, and you were just a child. We thought the evidence died with him." But Marcus Winters had been smarter than his killers realized. Before his death, he'd hidden copies of all his evidence in a safety deposit box registered under Grace's name. The key had been sewn into the lining of a jacket he'd given her for Christmas, along with a letter explaining everything. Grace had worn that jacket for years without knowing she carried the evidence that could have brought down Connecticut's most powerful families. "The jacket," Grace breathed, suddenly understanding why her father had insisted she keep it, even after she'd outgrown it. "He knew they were going to kill him." Sterling nodded miserably. "Marcus called me the night before he died. Said if anything happened to him, someone would eventually find what he'd hidden. He said justice might be delayed, but it wouldn't be denied forever." The revelation recontextualized Grace's entire life. Her family's financial struggles after her father's death, her mother's depression and eventual remarriage, Grace's own drive to become an educator, even her decision to accept the position at Westridge Academy. Everything had been shaped by a murder disguised as an accident. "Why are you telling me this now?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside her. Sterling looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Because watching Bryce attack you today, I saw myself, saw what I'd created, saw what happens when privilege becomes poison." He paused, downing the rest of his scotch. "And because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. I want to face whatever justice is left before I meet my maker." Attorney Martinez had been taking notes throughout the confession, her expression growing more grim with each revelation. "Judge Sterling, you understand that what you're describing constitutes conspiracy to commit murder, judicial corruption, and racketeering under federal RICO statutes." "I understand," Sterling replied. "I'm prepared to provide full cooperation with any investigation. Names, dates, bank records, everything. I want to tear down what we built before it destroys anyone else." The next 72 hours unleashed a tsunami of consequences that swept through Connecticut's power structure like a biblical plague. Sterling's confession triggered simultaneous investigations by the FBI, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Education's Civil Rights Division. By Monday morning, 6 judges had been arrested. 12 private school administrators were under federal indictment, and the entire Connecticut judicial system was under federal oversight. The media storm was unprecedented. Grace's story became the lead on every major news network, her classroom confrontation with Bryce Sterling serving as a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. The viral video now had over 50 million views, and #JusticeForGrace was trending worldwide. But the most dramatic transformation was happening within Westridge Academy itself. The revelation that their golden boy was the son of a murderous judge had shattered the student body's faith in their own social hierarchy. Madison Cross, who'd filmed Bryce's assault expecting to document Grace's humiliation, found herself accidentally creating the evidence that destroyed everything she'd believed about power and privilege. Madison had spent the weekend in her family's Hamptons estate, watching the video she'd created spread across social media like wildfire. But instead of the vindication she'd expected, the comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Grace and condemning of Bryce's actions. For the first time in her privileged life, Madison was on the wrong side of public opinion. "I made myself an accomplice to sexual assault," she'd told her mother through tears Sunday night. "I thought we were untouchable, but we're just bullies. Rich bullies, but still bullies." Victoria Cross, pharmaceutical heiress and Madison's mother, had built her fortune by navigating complex ethical landscapes. Watching her daughter's moral awakening, she'd made a decision that would shock Connecticut's social elite. "Then we change," Victoria had said simply. "We use our resources to support Grace, instead of destroying her. We become part of the solution. The Cross family's defection from the old guard sent shockwaves through Millbrook's country club circuit. If Victoria Cross, one of the most powerful women in Connecticut, was abandoning the traditional power structure, others would follow. The social realignment was swift and brutal, with families choosing sides based on whether they supported Grace or the corrupt system that had protected their children from consequences. Tyler Hunt's transformation was more complex. The 200-pound lacrosse player had suffered a severe concussion when Grace's defensive throw sent him into the classroom wall. During his hospital stay, forced into weeks of neurological observation, Tyler had time to reflect on his role in the harassment campaign. "I've been a coward my whole life," he'd told his father, corporate attorney Michael Hunt, during one of their bedside conversations. "I helped torture someone who was just trying to do her job. And for what? Because she made us think about uncomfortable things." Michael Hunt had built his career, destroying companies and lives through hostile takeovers and legal warfare. But watching his son's genuine remorse, he'd begun questioning the values he'd passed down to the next generation. "Maybe it's time we learned to build something instead of just tearing things down," Michael had admitted, a confession that would lead to his law firm taking Grace's case pro bono and representing other victims of the corruption network. Savannah Bell's reckoning came through social media, the very platform she'd used to destroy others. When she'd tried to post content defending Bryce and attacking Grace, the backlash had been immediate and devastating. Her follower count plummeted, brands canceled endorsement deals, and even her private school friends began distancing themselves from her toxic brand. "Everything I built was based on making other people feel small," she'd realized during a tearful Instagram Live session that would later be studied in media ethics courses. "I need to learn how to lift people up instead of tearing them down." The institutional changes at Westridge Academy were equally dramatic. Principal Harrison was fired within 48 hours of Sterling's confession, replaced by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a former urban school administrator with a reputation for zero tolerance toward harassment and discrimination. Coach Reynolds was banned from education permanently, his decades of enabling violent behavior finally catching up with him. The school board, under federal investigation and facing dozens of lawsuits, voted unanimously to implement the most comprehensive anti-harassment policies in private education. Independent oversight committees were established, diverse faculty were actively recruited, and the curriculum was overhauled to include perspectives that had been systematically excluded for decades. But the most significant change was cultural. The revelation that their elite institution had been built on corruption and violence had shattered the student body's faith in the very concept of inherited privilege. Students who'd never questioned their advantages were suddenly forced to confront the moral bankruptcy of a system that protected them from consequences while destroying others. Grace found herself at the center of this transformation. No longer a temporary substitute, but a permanent faculty member with unprecedented autonomy to reshape American history education. Her first initiative was establishing the Marcus Winters Memorial Scholarship, funded by settlements from the corruption scandal and designed to support first-generation college students pursuing education careers. The scholarship announcement had been made during a packed assembly where Grace addressed the entire student body for the first time since the assault. Standing at the same podium where generations of privileged speakers had celebrated tradition and legacy, Grace offered a different vision of what education could become. "My father believed that education should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable," she'd said, her voice carrying clearly through the Gothic Revival auditorium. "He died because powerful people preferred comfortable lies to disturbing truths. But truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it." The speech had been interrupted multiple times by standing ovations, not just from students but from faculty, parents, and community members who'd come to witness this historic moment. When Grace announced that Westridge Academy would be hosting an annual civil rights symposium in her father's honor, the applause lasted for over 5 minutes. Bryce Sterling's fate was both tragic and redemptive. Facing multiple felony charges and expelled from Westridge, he'd been placed in intensive therapy to address the trauma and toxic masculinity that had shaped his worldview. His father's confession had destroyed his family's social standing, but it had also freed him from the impossible expectations that had driven his cruelty. "I spent my whole life trying to live up to an image that was built on murder and corruption," he'd written in a letter to Grace, part of his court-mandated restorative justice process. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that watching you stand up to me taught me more about courage than 17 years of privilege ever did." Grace had chosen not to respond to the letter, but she'd kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the most damaged people could find redemption if they were willing to face the truth about themselves. The national impact of Grace's story extended far beyond Connecticut's borders. Her case became a landmark precedent for federal prosecution of institutional corruption, with attorneys general in 12 states launching similar investigations into private school networks. The Department of Education issued new guidelines requiring independent oversight of disciplinary actions at any institution receiving federal funding. More importantly, Grace's story inspired thousands of educators to speak up about harassment and discrimination they'd previously endured in silence. The hashtag Teachers Deserve. Better movement generated congressional hearings, leading to federal legislation protecting educators from retaliation and requiring mandatory bias training for school administrators. The cultural impact was equally profound. Grace's refusal to be silently victimized had shattered the myth that institutional power was absolute. Her story became required reading in education programs, law schools, and civil rights courses across the country. The woman who'd been hired as a temporary substitute had become a permanent symbol of resistance against injustice. 1 year later, Grace stood in the same classroom where Bryce Sterling had torn her dress and changed her life forever. But everything else had transformed beyond recognition. The walls displayed student artwork celebrating diversity and resistance. The bookshelves contained authors whose voices had been systematically excluded from traditional curricula, and the students themselves represented a rainbow of backgrounds that would have been impossible under the old regime. Her AP history class now included scholarship students from urban schools, first-generation immigrants, and children of working-class families who'd never dreamed of accessing elite education. They studied primary sources that told the complete story of American history, including the uncomfortable truths about how power really operated in their society. "Who can tell me about the difference between power and strength?" Grace asked her students, the same question she'd posed on that violent Friday afternoon a year earlier. A young black woman named Destiny Johnson raised her hand, her scholarship to Westridge funded by the Marcus Winters Memorial Program. "Power is what systems give you based on who you are. Strength is what you develop based on what you do. And sometimes strength has to challenge power to create justice." Grace smiled, recognizing her own words reflected back through a new generation that understood the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. These students would graduate with not just academic knowledge, but moral courage to continue the work of creating a more just society. The Grace Winters Foundation had grown into a national organization, providing scholarships for educators from underrepresented backgrounds and funding anti-harassment programs in schools across America. Grace's keynote address at conferences had been viewed over 20 million times. her message of standing up to institutional oppression resonating with audiences far beyond education. She'd been invited to speak at the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and dozens of universities where her story had become a case study in moral courage. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Judge Richard Sterling, serving a 15-year federal sentence for corruption and conspiracy, had written Grace a final letter before his death from cancer 6 months into his imprisonment. "You accomplished what your father set out to do," he'd written in handwriting made shaky by chemotherapy. "You brought justice to a system that thought it was above the law. Marcus would be proud of the woman you've become and the change you've created." Grace had visited Sterling's grave once, not to forgive him, but to acknowledge that even murderers could choose redemption in their final moments. His confession had cost him everything, but it had also freed her from 15 years of unknowing grief and given her the power to transform tragedy into triumph. Standing in her classroom on this anniversary afternoon, Grace thought about the path that had brought her from substitute teacher to national symbol of resistance. The torn dress hanging in her office closet, now preserved as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change when someone refused to accept injustice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Madison Cross, now a sophomore at Yale studying social justice advocacy. "Watching your UN speech in my political science class. Professor says you've fundamentally changed how institutions respond to harassment. Thank you for teaching me what real strength looks like." Similar messages arrived throughout the day from former students, fellow educators, and strangers whose lives had been touched by her story. Tyler Hunt was completing his first year at a community college, working with at-risk youth and learning to use his size to protect rather than intimidate. Savannah Bell had become a documentary filmmaker, creating content that exposed institutional injustice. Even Bryce Sterling had found a form of redemption, working as a counselor for other young men struggling with toxic masculinity while serving his community service sentence. His transformation wouldn't erase the harm he'd caused, but it proved that even the most damaged people could choose to become forces for healing rather than hurt. As the final bell rang and students filed out of her classroom, Grace reflected on the lesson she'd learned about the difference between victory and justice. Victory was personal, the moment when she'd stood over Bryce's bleeding form and felt vindicated. Justice was collective, the systematic changes that would protect future victims from experiencing what she'd endured. The torn dress had become a symbol, but the real transformation was in the hearts and minds of people who'd witnessed one woman's refusal to be silently victimized. Grace had taught her students about American history, but, more importantly, she'd shown them that history wasn't something that happened to other people in other times. History was being made every day by individuals who chose courage over comfort, truth over tradition, justice over privilege. Grace Winters had arrived at Westridge Academy as a temporary substitute, carrying nothing but a messenger bag and 15 years of teaching experience. She was leaving as a permanent force for change, carrying the knowledge that one person's courage could indeed transform the world. The quiet ones were quiet for a reason, and sometimes that reason was gathering strength for the moment when silence was no longer an option. The fabric had torn with a sound like breaking bones, but Grace Winters had never been broken. She'd been forged, tempered by injustice and hardened by resistance into something unbreakable. And in teaching others to find their own strength, she'd created a legacy that would outlast any individual victory. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure no one else had to face alone what she'd survived. And in that mission, Grace Winters had found not just vindication, but purpose that would echo through generations of students who'd learned that real strength comes not from avoiding confrontation, but from facing it with courage, preparation, and the unshakable belief that truth will always triumph over power. The bell had rung, the students had left, and Grace Winters stood alone in her classroom, surrounded by the evidence of change she'd created through one moment of refusing to be a victim. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to mentor young people who were learning the difference between power and strength. But tonight, she would go home knowing that her father's death had not been in vain. That 15 years of unknowing grief had been transformed into a force for justice that would protect countless others from experiencing the same loss. Grace Winters had torn down a system built on corruption and erected something better in its place, proving that sometimes the most important lessons aren't found in textbooks, but in the courage to stand up when standing down would be easier. The woman who'd been hired as a substitute had become irreplaceable, and the lesson she'd taught would be remembered long after the last student graduated.